Before we get started, I just want to come clean. April and I are actually on a recruiting mission, and we are looking for people who are willing to become a sort of informal local organizer in your own existing community. And what we're really trying to do is present some tools that we think are useful and that anyone can use, anyone can pick up. And if they look interesting to you, we would like to support you in any way we can in taking on some of that work in your own community. So we are trying to share some information, but we're doing it with a purpose. And because ultimately things are looking a little bumpy, and it seems like a good time to talk about how we can all build our own lifeboats. So before we begin though, April.
So, well, first I should mention that Ben and I have been working with small local networks of change for 20 plus years, and we think that what we're going to offer is simple but powerful tools. And so we invite you to, well, tell us at the end whether they are tools that you find useful. One of the tools that we use is storytelling and metaphor. And so we would like to start the session by having the classic fable of the blind men and the elephant. And let me just ask, is there anybody here who would like to give us a synopsis of what that fable says? Anybody want to take a try at doing that? Yeah.
Rosemary.
It is a story I'm familiar with from working in schools. It's a really lovely old tale about, I think it was originally set in India, perhaps. A number of men end up trying to figure out what this thing is, but they are limited by not being able to see and the big picture, and the individual descriptions of the various parts that they each inspect are extremely different and limited. And yes, and at the end, they take off their blindfolds and are able to see the big picture. It's been a long time since I got to read the details, so sorry, I can't give you more of the lovely description of the trunk or the tail.
Thanks, Rosemary. That's certainly sufficient for us to work with, and as you're all probably recognizing, this is a metaphor for our work. So trying to see the bigger picture more completely and understanding that none of us has the complete idea of what a situation is or what goes into it, so that we require all of our perspectives together in order to be somewhat realistic about what to do and what we see. So in doing this work, we have found it useful to have a series of agreements to begin with. And so we would now invite you to consider what we think are the essentials as we work together. And then we'll ask you, are there any things that you would like to add to that? But really, we think if we're any of us able to fully show up and participate, that we need some framework and some agreed ground rules to, well, to ground us. So the first one is to recognize that we are all in this together. And that can be a very surface thing to say, but it's actually quite profound. And if you think about the people in the elephant, It does take all of us, and we are all of us here, maybe not together, but certainly getting ourselves aligned, and these sort of agreements help with that. You always have choice about what you do. And another way to say that is that nobody has to do anything. We're all adults, and we've all made some choices about how we will be and where we will be. To the corollary of you always have choices, that of course there are consequences for each choice, and those need to be considered. And as we're working together, I found it useful to listen first for understanding before putting forward my opinion. I have lots of opinions, but whether or not they fit or advance anyone's understanding or help us to be together on the page is a moot point. When you do speak, we ask that you speak from the heart, so deeply held feelings and contributions and convictions. And as part of that, it's most useful if you suspend judgment about yourself and about anybody else. We hope that we come together in a spirit both of generosity and of curiosity. And I really like it and work best under the conditions where people are generous with me, put up with my foibles, with my eccentricities, and still invite my contribution. We've added this to all the work that we do now, which is that we actually do have a meter called a fun meter to make sure we're having enough fun. And we try to at least have a little bit of fun. And if we're not having enough, then we try to amp that up, because we know that with that territory comes kind of the pathway to joy in the end, and to really reinforcing our purpose and our meaning together.
And that ultimately, this is having fun is a key part of resilience and how we come together as people. So we want to give everyone an opportunity to say, can you live with these ground rules? Do they work for you? If so, if I could just get a thumbs up in the screen. And if there's anything else that you need, hands up, and then we'll give you the mic, and you can ask what else, or you can say what else it is you'd like from the group. I'm seeing thumbs up and no hands up. All right, well, thank you very much for that. And we want to, even though we have some tools that we want to share, we also want to make sure, we want to understand where we're all coming from. And we've invited you to this webinar on building a lifeboat. And we know it means something to us. It means something about resilience and working in a particular way. But we also want to know what it means to you. So we'd like to start by just giving you each an opportunity to introduce yourself and say a little bit about what does it mean, what does building a lifeboat mean to you? Why are you here today? What is interesting about this idea? And the circle as I see it will be Allison, Rosemary, Pam, Carly, then April, then me.
Okay, great. Hopefully you can hear me.
Can.
So hi, everyone. Really nice to see you all and be here with all of you. My name is Allison. I live in Richmond, BC, and I am increasingly concerned about what's happening on the planet. And I have a long history of seeing what can happen when people who care about each other come together. And I really feel the need to do that right now, related to what's happening on the planet in a nutshell. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Rosemary. I'm in the Lekwungen territories, living in what is called the city of Victoria. So I find the city lacks community, and this whole lifeboat idea. Yes, there are things that are increasingly concerning, and I wish to. I'm interested in building my own resiliency and and connecting with other people with regard to that. So there's resilience and mutual aid, I guess. Yes.
Mhm. Mhm.
And community. Yes.
That's over. I can't remember my own circle. I think it's over to Carly.
I had myself going after Pam or Pamela, but I'll go.
You're probably right, but
All right. Well, hi everybody. I'm Carly. I'm in Vancouver on the unceded Musqueams, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. Yeah, I don't know. I'm interested in this model. I feel like I live in a co-op, and I do feel like we've built a bit of a lifeboat here, and I'd like to see how that can be extended outside of my co-op, and what that might look like. Feeling a lot of rage today as the NDP is threatening to not let Angeli Appadurai run. So yeah, I feel like I need something more tangible to hang on to, because it feels like our governments are 100% letting us down.
I'm Pam, and I'm in the unceded lands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples as well, Rosemary. I'm in the Poker Creek watershed, and I seem to have found myself kind of on the fringes of a number of groups in this area. One of them is a community association. The other is the Poker Creek watershed folks. The other is a climate force group. Earth Regenerators, as you know, Ben. And I'm the Cool Kit project, which was an initiative by the district to bring in a carbon drawdown program into the district. But mainly it was actually an excuse to get the community together and talking to people. And I'm in a co-op as well. So I'm in this position where I do not feel very confident whatsoever about being a community organizer or any of that sort of stuff. But I'm at this on the fringes of all these different things. And I know that right now, I know that the notion of organizing on a bioregional scale is delicious and wonderful, and that's not my mission. I don't go for a political solution. I feel that we are in collapse. We're right, where it's happening. And so I feel that neighborhood resiliency is absolutely essential. And my scale is walking distance. So I don't know what I can do with what you are offering, but I am here to take it in and see. I'm going off with the Poker Creek people this afternoon after this meeting, and I'm going to be seeing the Climate Force people tomorrow. So I don't know what kind of seeds. I am looking for an entry point. And that's one of the things that and how to talk about this without scaring people off.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's more than enough for me.
Mm-hmm. Over to you, April.
I'm April Struthers. I come to you from the unceded territory of the Sea-Slash Nation. And I work in change projects in all sorts of different places. I too am looking for a group to be resilient with. Have been doing work for years with Ben and with Allison, and want to have some way of coming together that helps me be secure in some ways, or more secure in some ways, whether it's food security or emotional, social support and fairness, really. And that's what has drawn me to this work and the work with Ben. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you all for sharing. And we've been doing hosting different lifeboat conversations. We call them lifeboat circles, and it's sort of a center stone of how we're working. And what we find is that there's overlapping similarity in all of the circles that we do, no matter who we bring into it, with some important differences. But a couple of the things that themes that come up when people start talking about lifeboats. One is recognition that they are adaptable and flexible, recognizing that we don't really know what we're up for, what we're in for. And so one of the things that people need in a lifeboat is a lifeboat that can grow, change, evolve as conditions change and evolve. We also recognize that the lifeboat needs to be practical. We want to talk about things like what can we do in our walking distance with our neighbors around things like food security and emergency response and health and safety. And with that comes an understanding that ultimately, I always say cooperation is our secret human superpower, but we've lost that ability. I think we've actually had that ability beaten out of us quite violently. But we are in the place now where we want to find that sense of social connection and social support again. And we also recognize that there are a lot of different skills necessary to keep a boat running. So we need to find ways of bringing together people with diverse perspectives, talents, skills, and abilities. And that means we need to increase and improve our tools for collaborating across difference. And so what we're talking about today, the model that we're presenting, we think is a way of accomplishing all of these goals, bringing together the social and the practical in a system, in a way of working that allows us to adapt to whatever might be coming down the road.
So the lifeboat then is really a cooperative network of people that you can turn to when you need help. It's mostly a way of working together, and it focuses on the small practical steps in a way to maximize our learning and our ability to respond when the unexpected happens. And we know there are certain formats, you could say, for this that allow this to happen more than others. And that's what we're talking about today. So really, the goal with our networks is to be connected, to grow capacity over time, to make sure that the learning that comes out of the growth and the change and the adaptation get shared around, and understanding that collective learning could be quite powerful. We offer through this network, because of the higher amount of connectivity and kind of interaction that can go on, possibly a stronger social support than we're used to. And in the end, increased resilience will almost naturally and organically grow out of these aspects.
Mm-hmm. And I should add, this is, April and I have been working independently with a wide variety of change makers over many decades, more decades than needs to be listed. And but the model that we're sharing is something that we've actually reality tested in my local community on Pender Island. So all of the things that we're talking about, we've actually done, we put in place here where I live. And so I also want to weave the story of how they developed a little bit, because I want to emphasize that this is all stuff that we did neighbor to neighbor without any special resources. And in fact, a lot of the work that we've been doing here in my local community all started when one of our mutual friends hung a flyer and sent out an email and invited people to one of our local coffee shops. And basically the flyer was something like, "Are you freaked out about the climate emergency? If so, join us on Thursday." And there were a couple things that happened really quickly. One was in that first meeting, we often joke about the fact that more people showed up than we were expecting, and not a single person left without crying. We were all, the ability to share with, basically we all were feeling very isolated and alone going into it. And just simply to be in a space with other people where we felt we could talk honestly about our fears and our concerns was emotionally really powerful. And a lot of what we're talking about today really comes from that seed of what happens simply when you create the space where people can come together and show up fully and be present with each other. And what we've, how we've refined this over the years is there is this central strategy to everything that we're talking about, sort of a meta process. And that is that we treat everything that we do, all of our decisions and all of our projects as a series of experiments. And there's a number of reasons why this is a powerful model that we'll explain, but it really is quite a simple strategy when you come down to it. It means you start where you are with what you have. You figure out what the next step looks like. You don't worry about the 10th step. You figure out what the next step looks like. You do something, you take action, but you do it in a way where periodically you pause and reflect on how that's going and how that's working. And then you just repeat, you iterate. And in that process, what generally happens is through taking the action, through talking together, sharing and developing a shared understanding of the situation, even if it's imperfect and incomplete, and then doing something together, you start to build bonds of trust and understanding in a kind of a turbocharged fashion. So really the way we shorthand all of this is start where you are, aim, act, reflect, repeat. So under everything that we're talking about today is really that simple idea. And then a lot of the particulars are just nuanced ways of doing those different steps.
So the question then is, how do we put that into action? And again, it's pretty simple. So there's two parts to this plan. The first part is kind of the grounding, and the second part is the doing and seeing what happens. So the first step would be to invite your friends to a conversation, just like in the coffee shop on Pender. Then take a look at what you've got. And remember, we're saying start where you are with what you've got. So you list the assets and you map them, and that can be very sophisticated or it can be very simple. It works equally well on the back of a napkin or on a large electronic worksheet that we use. Then once you have that, you've got friends and you know what is on offer from your friends, then you look at a strategy session. What do we want to work on together? And there's a way of sort of prioritizing what comes out of that. Then you design a real small experiment over a short period, like 3 or 4 months. You keep track of what's going on with your experiment, and then you debrief. So what the heck happened in that experiment? What of that do we want to take and move it on further? So you repeat. You have another strategy session. Things will have emerged. You'll decide on which of those things you're going to work with, and you go into the cycle again.
So we're just going to unpack each of those steps a little bit more. And so the first one is inviting your friends to a conversation. And there are a couple important things to note here. And in some ways, we are doing some decolonizing work. We are upsetting some of our normal paradigms or some of our normal assumptions about how we go about organizing. And one is that this is an invitation, not an argument. We are not trying to convert anyone to anything. We are simply trying to say, I'm concerned about what's going on. If you're concerned, let's talk. There's no argument. There's no who's right, who's wrong. And there's also no worries that if somebody isn't ready or interested in that conversation, that they need to be there. It's kind of we want to work with the people who show up. But there's something important going on as well, just simply in making that invitation. And one of the factors that we are dealing with right now is something called the spiral of silence and pluralistic ignorance. And these are big words that simply mean we don't really have a good read on the prevalence of different attitudes out there. For climate, we know, for example, there's the six Americas of climate change, where instead of where they delineate different levels of concern or awareness around the climate. And climate change deniers in the US in 2021, so this is all, and this is shifting quickly, was 9% of the population. Tiny, tiny little percentage of the population. But that percentage of the population gets a lot of airtime and is very aggressive about putting those views forward. So what happens is two things happen. One is that we get a false sense that they actually are more, there are more of them than we think. And the other thing is that they often make it really uncomfortable for people to say what they feel and say what they believe. And I think most of us have been in a situation where we put something out about the climate and we've been attacked. And a lot of people learn very quickly to shut down when that happens, to just quiet themselves. It's not worth the trouble. But what that means is there's a lot of people out there quietly, more than concerned, there's a lot of people out there who are alarmed and upset and worried, but they don't know who to talk to and they think there's no one they can talk to. So simply putting out that invitation where you can honestly say to yourself, to your friends and family, I'm concerned about this and I want to have a conversation, is already doing some of the work. We're not trying to change anybody, but we are trying to make it easy for people who already feel that way to come forward. And the other thing that we that's important in how we are working is small is beautiful. We don't need a lot of people to show up. And in fact, there's a lot of good research on sort of effective team sizes and effective group sizes. And really, the most effective work teams tend to be between 5 and 6 and really start to max out around 15 or so. So really, we're not trying to create a big, mass movement. We're not trying to go viral. We're actually trying to find those core people that we can work well with, and the ring of supporters around them, the 15 or 20 friends that surround the core team who can take on some of the work. So we don't need everyone to show up. We really are just creating an invitation to find the right people and to go sort of a coalition of the willing. Oh, and actually, as a side note, I don't know if any of you have read Saving Us by Katharine Hayhoe, where she talks, she's a climate communication person. And one of the things that she mentions is we need to connect around our shared values. And so this is also what we're proposing here is you're reaching out to the people you already know in your life around the values you already share. And finding a way of coming together that way. And no matter what community you're pulling together, climate is around us all. It's a shared value that we all have. So we also want to create a place where it's really easy to come together and start to weave together our understandings.
So the first step in this whole plan is to host that conversation. And you will have identified other people that are also concerned, and you're going to build up kind of a shared picture of what the lifeboat looks like and what it means to build one. And of course, that is determined entirely by who shows up and where you are as to what that meaning will be. So we're really listening for shared understanding. We're listening for connections. We're looking for where we can make different connections. And this all comes from just a place of curiosity to see what emerges and where there is common ground. So then you will build on that common ground.
But it is important to note, we are all coming from different places. And there are a number of things that are happening right now. And we probably all have experienced this personally, our own state of concern, our own understanding of what the challenges are that we're facing. As I mentioned, there's research that comes out of Yale that's called the 6 Americas of climate change or of global warming. And they identify sort of 6 stages of awareness and concern. And the ones that are most important to us are people move from being cautiously kind of curious about it, trying to understand what is going on with the climate. Is that something we should be worried about? To being concerned, but feeling like it's not an urgent issue. Yet, I'm sure my kids are going to have a problem with it. That argument that people give. To being alarmed and really recognizing that this is a crisis that we are facing currently. Interestingly, the alarmed category is now the largest category in the opinion polling. The most recent poll was done over a year ago, and I'm really anxiously waiting for the next one to come out. But over a third of Americans are alarmed. And I'm an American, so I can get away with saying this. And if a third of Americans are alarmed, in the rest of the world, it's probably a much higher number. And that number is not only the biggest number, it's the fastest growing number in the research. So there are a lot of people who are just coming to that level of awareness about what we're facing. And that's going to bring with it all sorts of grief and other emotions, other hard and heavy emotions along with it. So in this work, we also have to make sure that there is space for people to process those feelings and those emotions. And like I mentioned, our first meeting on Pender, there wasn't a single person who didn't cry. And none of us were expecting it. We thought we were coming to talk about the climate. And we realized it was something that was really hitting us really deep in the core. And then once people start to work through some of those heavier emotions in their way, they're going to come to an action-ready state. But there also is probably an evolution of what that readiness looks like. And I don't have any research to back this up, but my experience has been generally people start, I am overly simplifying it by saying people start in prepper mode. They start to think about, how do I grow food? I'm going to put in a garden. It's a first response. It's okay, I'll put in a garden, we'll be good. Eventually, you start to realize that it's a bit more complicated than that. Gardens are great, but there's a lot of other needs that people need to have filled and other concerns that we have looking at what might be coming down the pike. So people start to grow their level of complexity in their understanding of what we're facing. And that usually leads to people wanting to reach out to community. And to anybody who's done reaching out community, people are messy. So once we start to try to figure out how we build those connections, we are going to very quickly come up against some of those old human nature bugaboos, especially complexified by the fact that we are all experiencing some real emotional turbulence right now because of collapse awareness and climate awareness.
So what we've really done then is to try to create a simple conversation guide for how you go through this with your friends. And we think that having that guide will make it easier for the blind ones to build that picture of what the elephant might look like. Do you want to speak about the power of the circle, Ben?
Well, I think it is, this is also leaning into Indigenous wisdom, and it is a very simple approach, but one that, like many simple approaches, is incredibly powerful. And the idea is really to create an opportunity where everyone can show up and participate, where we can build, it basically is a way of embodying the blind ones and the elephant. Where we each get an opportunity to describe that part that we hold, looking for ways of connecting the dots. And it undermines our current paradigm where we try to argue to win points. We try to win which part is the right part, rather than try to weave together how our parts might fit. Even holding the possibility that I may not see how our parts fit together right now, but we know that they do. In the circle, we are building that shared understanding where we are all adding to the center without falling into arguments with each other.
We're also building peer relationships, and that's really hard, really hard. We're used to working in hierarchy. And so understanding that our peers have the same rights as we do, and having sort of a format to make that work consistently is really important.
So once we have the conversation, then the next step is just documenting where there's agreement. And we've alluded to this already, but we're not arguing, we're not trying to come up with the right plan. What we're trying to do is identify where there are shared areas of shared overlapping agreement. We talk about this, what generally happens is in that lifeboat conversation, we give people an opportunity to say, what's your lifeboat look like? What are some of the features that are in your lifeboat? And we see whether or not there is agreement around those features. So in a way, we start to build up a sort of sketch of what that lifeboat might look like. And we call that our version X.0, with this idea that we're working iteratively towards some lifeboat. One of our sayings is building the lifeboat is the lifeboat. So we know we're not ever going to get to version X.0. That's a kind of our North Star on the horizon. And that's actually good. It gives us some power and some flexibility because we're not doing a blueprint. We don't have to get every detail right. All we need to do is capture where is there agreement? Where are our shared values in this? And it only needs to be good enough for now, safe enough to try. For any of you who are familiar with sociocracy, that framework underpins the work that we're doing. If you don't know sociocracy, it doesn't matter. The wisdom in sociocracy is commonsensical. They've just found a way of pulling it together. But one of their sayings is good enough for now, safe enough to try, and it's incredibly empowering. And we'll also talk about the importance of a time-limited plan. We're only going to figure out what we can do in the next 3 or 4 months. So that allows it to be a manageable, safe enough to try, and a good enough for now. And again, we're not trying to come to universal agreement or absolute consensus. What we're doing is just sketching out where there are some agreements and where there are some key features that we can agree on. If there are areas of disagreement, we don't work on that. We don't have to. We don't need to. We will have enough to do if we can just focus on those areas where we do agree. And when we say document, the document doesn't have to be anything complicated. What we've been doing in our work on Pender is we use a lot of Google Docs. And the project as it has unfolded on Pender has turned into, among other things, our farm, which is High Grove Farm. And our driver statement, our plan for the farm is about 1.5 pages. And all it does is it outlines a couple of our visions for what might be possible here, and our core agreements, what really we think we need to be able to work well together, and some guiding principles around basically some high-level strategies. On the farm, one of ours is biomimicry. And so that's, we lean into nature. We try to learn from nature. But the documentation is really quite simple. It's words that came directly from our circle conversations about what that farm might look like. And it's also, I should say, the Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. And that's an important aspect to highlight from the beginning. We know the words that we write, the ideas that we put down are going to evolve and change. And that's good. That's okay. We don't have to nail everything down right now. But we do want to have it documented, so just so that we have a little bit of a memo, really, about remember that conversation that we had where we had those agreements. Let's write that down so that we can turn to it when we need it.
Now, the next step after your agreements and your documentation and your conversation is to find out who's who at the zoo, who has access to what, and are you willing to share it? And this is my favorite kind of exercise to do. And Allison will be laughing because she's been involved with me with mapping assets and figuring out a strength-based path based on that. So you get probably a physical map, and it can be electronic or it can be on a piece of white paper glued to the window. And you're identifying what the context is around you. And it's almost effortless in a way. Once you pose that question to people, you get all sorts of stuff coming out. And of course, the subtext to this is that you're working together, you're talking together, you're putting your meaning out there, and you're building a social strength right there. And you're finding out a whole bunch about your friends, neighbors, and colleagues. And one of the things that I find is fascinating is that person down the road that I don't like a lot, I found out was somebody I really needed in my lifeboat because of that person's skill sets that I didn't have. And so all of a sudden that puts a different whole complexion on what my relationship could be there. So you're starting to find out skills, resources, and people that are all around you. And it's a rich mother lode of what we need to know and haven't quite known before. And once you have that, then you build from what you know, and you will be able to show a current version of what's out there, what's kind of on offer. And you ask people based on that information, who would you turn to if you had a question about X? In my case, it would be accounting. I would have a question about, and also who owns a backhoe. So, I would find that out, and also say, what other resources do you know about that would help us to do what it is that we want to do? A rich conversation. In my case, in my neighborhood at one point, it led to creating a tool library, because that was what people wanted to work on, and that's what they were willing to share. Even quite expensive tools. Worked out a set of agreements of what to do if I broke your chainsaw and what that meant, and so on. And that worked really well for about 5 years, actually.
Mhm. And I think another thing to point out is there's something subversive about this process. First of all, people love talking about what they are interested in, their hobbies, their passions. So it gives you an opportunity to engage people in a conversation that is comfortable, and that curiosity, sort of like April was saying, it breeds its own momentum.
Yeah.
By having those conversations, and people are consistently surprised by what they learn, and that's a form of relationship building, allowing people to go from maybe one-dimensional or two-dimensional caricatures that you have of them to understanding all of the different perspectives and skills that they bring. So it's important to have the asset map, but it's almost more important to do the mapping, to go through that process of talking to people about their skills and their interests.
So this is an example of a map. It can be done very quickly and easily, and Post-its is a cheap way to do that. And you can categorize things. You can have different colors for different activities or different sets of things. Then you start to link those separate Post-it notes, and you will find there are relationships you have now. And you will also find there's places that you want to create relationships, and you can map that as well. And that gives you sort of a forward strategy then, and a direction for what you're going to do. And it increases your learning. Well, it certainly does for me. I'm a visual learner, so I'm in love with maps and diagrams and graphs and ranges and all of that kind of stuff. Now, we use this high touch method. We also use an electronic method through Miro, which has a huge whiteboard with lots of different facilities for using shapes and mapping techniques. And that's quite fun too.
And it just reminds me that one of the things that we haven't mentioned is, if this does sound interesting to you, we also have what we're calling deeper dives, where we unpack each of the steps and the tools and can actually provide you with a step-by-step how-to actually host that circle conversation, how to actually do the map. Right now, we just want to kind of cover the concept at a higher level. But there are lots of tools, and there are lots of different ways that you can do this work, and it's all stuff that anybody can do with a little bit of coaching. including the next step, which is hosting a strategy session. And what we've done on Pender, we call it Pender Earth. And it was one of the things that grew out directly from those initial conversations that we had in the cafe. The first thing that happened in those conversations was we all decided we needed more of this. So we decided to meet once a month and have these conversations. And as we started to have those conversations, we moved through a lot of the emotional processing to actually some frustration that here in our local community, there were lots of people working on lots of things, but they didn't know what each other was working on. And so people were stepping on each other's toes, and there was a lot of duplication of effort and, and some petty turf wars and that kind of thing. So we thought, this is crazy. We need to just get everybody who is working on anything to do with the climate in a room to talk to each other. And we use something called an open space technology, which is ridiculously simple. And basically it meant we reserved our community hall. We put an ad in our local monthly magazine and did a very similar thing and said, if you are willing to start working on anything to do with the climate, please come at this date and its time. And we presented the challenge, which is, what can we work on in the next 3 to 4 months to actually move in the right direction? Maybe it won't get us all the way where we need to go, but where's something that we could do right here, right now with the people in the room that could feel like we're starting to make a difference? And we created opportunities. What we did in Pender Earth, but you don't have to do anything this complicated. We set up separate tables for people who were more interested in transportation or ecosystem restoration or political action or arts and education. And this was all generated by people who came to the meeting. We went around at the beginning and we said, what part of the climate are you most interested in? What do you most want to talk about? And we developed those tables. And then we just had people playfully come up with as many ideas as they could. What are a lot of crazy ideas we could do in 3 to 4 months with the resources available? And then once we did that and we had a whole bunch of ideas on the table, we had people talk about, okay, so of these ideas, which are the ones that are going to get us the furthest, fastest? We call it ROE, return on effort. What are the things that we can work on together that are going to have the biggest return for the amount of effort that we can put into it now? And this is actually quite simple for people to do if you invite them into it. You can get into a challenge of how do you assess the return, but the conversations themselves are really valuable. And then we do something called vote with your feet, which is we know that no one's going to come in and fund our lifeboat. We're not going to have paid staff. We're not going to be able to, just hire somebody to go do it. So all of the projects that we come up with have to be passion projects, basically. They have to be the kinds of projects that somebody's willing to take on. And again, we can go into the details of how you do this in open space technology, but you basically just have somebody say, I am willing to lead this project. And we actually have little 8.5 by 11 cards where you put the name of the project that you're hoping to do. And you go stand in one corner of the room and say, if anybody wants to work on this with me, come join me. And people self-select. And then we gave everybody a little chance to say, okay, share your emails and contact information and figure out when you're going to meet next. And that was the end of the meeting. We've hosted these multiple times. COVID was a little bit of a hiccup in how often we hosted them, but we have generated literally dozens of small scale projects using this approach, which have gone everything from, we have the Climate Change Arts Brigade who have started a podcast where they are publishing poems and other creative pieces to try to inspire people to action, down to a discount bulk buy on rain barrels. And all of the projects are basically championed by somebody. And then it gives an opportunity for people who are interested in those projects to self-select. And one of the things that was sort of actually to be expected, but it was still surprising to us, is we later started to hear about other projects that we had no hand in, that didn't happen at one of our meetings, but happened because people started a relationship in one of our meetings. including the purchase of, I think, a 30-acre, no, 12-acre, a 12-acre conservation property. And the purchase of that property happened because two people came and didn't know that they had a connection to this work. And because of that relationship that started at one of the early meetings, it eventually turned into a set-aside conservation project.
So you're at the point now where you've identified a bunch of projects where there'll be good return on effort. And you've got people who have self-selected into a number of projects. What do you do? How do you run the experiment? Well, it's quite simple, and it's a scientific method, but it can be visualized as try something you think will work and do it in a way that you'll know if it's worked or not. That is the scientific method. And this kind of definition of that comes from Bernard Bockelbrink, who says, try something that you think will happen and then do it in a way so you can tell if it does or not. It's not complicated. It doesn't involve expensive equipment. You don't have to wear a lab coat. You don't need big beakers and Bunsen burners or anything of that sort. You just have to be able to tell if it works or not. And that's where the mantra of good enough for now, safe enough to try. So good enough is the idea about your experiment. And you're at a point where you could try it and see what happens, and that's safe. And it's small scale too. There's not a lot of risk involved here. So you get the experience of doing something in the real world as quickly as possible, because that's where and how we actually accelerate our learning, to put things out in the world and see how they work. And the question is, if we do X, we'll get Y, or that's the expectation. And then you check to see if that actually happened. One of the ways to do that is to set up a logbook that just takes a look at, time and effort. And it can be quite a simple logbook. It documents what you've done at each stage, who's done it, how you've done it, any special features that you need to find out and to pay attention to next time. And maybe, Ben, you want to talk about the Bean Collective and that experiment.
I would love to talk about the Bean Collective. And I think that, what we're really trying to underscore here is it doesn't have to be complicated. And our farm was approached a couple of years ago by some neighbors who were concerned about food security. And so thinking about what we could do with what we had and what made sense. There were a number of families, probably 9 families, that decided they were going to try to see if we could all grow enough beans to support our families in the plots that we had available in the garden. And so the goal was simple. We were just trying to see how many pounds of beans or kilos of beans we could grow in the space that we had available. And our logbook was simply a map of the garden beds. And then in each garden bed, we recorded when we planted and what kind of bean we planted, and kept little notes about, any special, did we do anything, a different technique, or add any kinds of mulch or anything like that. Really simple record of what we planted. And then at the end of the year, we harvested by putting all of the beans from each bed into one large old pig food bag, and winnowed the beans and weighed them. And in that process, we were able to identify some beans that worked better in our garden, some beans that worked worse. And when we debriefed at the end of the season, it wasn't just the numbers, but it was that ability to look back and sort of remind ourselves of some of those special things that we did. Again, it's the mnemonic device. It's not necessarily that you need to have everything written down and everything documented, but you need to leave breadcrumbs for yourself so that it becomes easier at the end. And, we all experience that, right? We get so busy doing stuff doing stuff and responding to the little changes that are necessary to keep things moving that we just forget. So the logbook is really just a little diary where you note down what's happening so that at the end of your 3 or 4 months, you can look back and remind yourself of what you did.
And in the logbook, you'll have key action items that must be done. Milestones, if you have them, you can establish what those would be. What the inputs are, how much effort went into it, how much time, how much resources, how many pounds of starter beans, and what it is you're hoping will happen at the end.
Mm-hmm. So now once you've set up your experiment, you need to go and do stuff. And there's a couple important things, and thinking of the experiment is also useful, or thinking of it as an experiment is useful, in part because of something we call psychological inoculation. And basically, psychological inoculation is letting people know ahead of time that we might be experiencing some discomfort. There might be some frustration. And the reason we want to do this is we have a natural tendency to think that problems are bad, right? Or frustration is a sign that something is going wrong, something isn't okay. But the reality is, in an experiment, well, it's an experiment. We don't know what's going to happen. We want to be curious. We want to be open. And so by letting people, by kind of framing things as an experiment, we make it okay for things to go wrong. It's just part of the experiment. Isn't that interesting? And we do this in we actually, drawing on sociocracy, there's a process in there called navigating the attentions, where we highlight that tensions are a good thing. In particular, tensions occur where the greatest learning is possible. So once we turn that fear of something being tense into a, wow, this is great, look at the opportunity here, we can do some really quick learning. Especially when we use this process where we identify the tension and then we go deeper into it. And we recognize the only thing that's really important at this point is that there's something under the surface that is animating that tension. There's a tension between how the world is currently working and how we're hoping it would work. And when we can isolate those and kind of say, oh, here are those different drivers, here are those different forces that are at work, it turns something from being a binary good versus bad, right versus wrong, into these interesting dynamics where we can make choices. The way I think of it is it's like we can dial up or down some of those drivers. And I really like this concept, so I have a tendency to go too far into it. But for our work right now, what's important is we want to make it safe ahead of time to have for things to not go according to plan, and to have a structure in place where we go, oh, okay, let's talk that through. So we want to make sure that those structures are set up in place ahead of time. And then you just make sure that you are maintaining the logbook. It's one thing to set up the logbook. It's another thing to make sure everyone's making notes in it as they go forward. But one of the ways to do that is just to have regular check-ins. And that's where it becomes really handy to have one person who has taken on that role. And it can be as simple as an email every so often, or a phone call, or just someone who is willing to check in and say, hey, I noticed we haven't had any entries in the last couple of weeks. Has anyone been doing anything? Again, just to make sure that there's a little bit of a breadcrumb trail so that we can recreate what's happened.
And then you get to the point where you spent the time doing your experiment, recording what's gone on as you go along, checking in, but you want to have a deeper dive into, so what does this mean in the end? What did we actually achieve? And what did we expect when we started as compared to what was experienced as you went through it, and that you're now looking at the end? And the overlap area is where the real gold is, I guess you would say, or where the really good soil is in this setup, because you will be able to get your expectations closer to real experience. And that means you're more accurate in how you spend your time and in what you achieve. So you'll get probably closer to your outcomes after you go through the steps and while you debrief. And for me in projects, this is the most exciting point. I like to combine this with celebrations. But it's good to have the debrief first and then celebrate second. Otherwise, you might not get to all those important points.
And I think it's also important to mention at this point, just to make it really explicit, we have no illusions that the lifeboat will make things okay. We have no illusions that we'll do a couple of these experiments and we will suddenly discover the secret to all of the problems, the silver bullet that will make it all okay. And that's also why the celebration and the learning become part of the resilience, because it is becoming the Swedish young person, Greta, one of the things that she says is hope is an action. And what we are we're not only building our learning and our ability to function materially better in whatever situation we're facing, but we are also growing our shared sense of efficacy and our shared sense of being able to work through and overcome challenges as we face them. So the debrief and the reflection and the celebration are equal parts of that twinned process. And once you finish that, once you've gone through the debrief, it also naturally suggests returning to the next step, right? Revisiting your strategy, recommitting to projects. Sometimes you think you're going to get a project done in 3 or 4 months and you don't. And the debrief then becomes an opportunity to recommit to see whether you can do it again. Sometimes the projects you realize are not doable yet, and that there's another step before the one that you wanted to take that you need to focus on. And sometimes the projects work really well and they lead to step number 2. And all of those things are possible, and all of those things feel like successes when you have it incorporated into this learning cycle. So I think that pretty much covers what our suggested model is. And again, why we're doing this is we really want to find ways of supporting people who are ready and willing to start to activate their own local network. We're not seeing this as inventing a new network. You're not really growing anything, or I want to be careful. You are reaching into your already existing network. And in doing so, you're finding ways that it can grow, because each of the steps also provides an opportunity. Inviting friends to a conversation, doing your asset mapping, hosting the strategy session, doing the debrief are all opportunities for new folks to get involved. And they're all appealing opportunities. They're all easy entry for people to figure out how they can fit themselves into the work that's already happening and to expand it. So one of the sort of secret aspects of this model is we're creating as many opportunities as we can to extend the invitation. And you only need to start where you are with who is willing to show up. But as you do the work, there are going to be new allies that you're going to find along the way. So I think we've actually talked about what this looks like in practice. We've given you a lot of different examples. I think I just want to also mention that we are not thinking about any of these lifeboats living in isolation. And ultimately, you can imagine that there is one great huge lifeboat out there that we can all connect through. But what we envision happening is that walking distance lifeboat, that neighborhood level lifeboat, where you're working shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, with your friends, with your colleagues on material projects on the ground where you are stays connected through telecommunication globally with other people who are working around the world on similar projects, so that we create a shared language about what kinds of things we're learning and how we can share that information more easily across geographic and cultural differences. So it creates an opportunity where we can celebrate our own successes, share what we're learning, share what's working. We can also find that mutual aid network where we can ask, has anyone else encountered this kind of challenge? What have you done? Or even identify resources. Who else in the network might know where the right tools are that, you know, that are maybe the next neighborhood over that could be made available for what we're doing. So we want to be really clear that the idea of the lifeboat is not, they're not isolated, that we want to actually create a fleet of lifeboats who stay connected and interconnected and share what they're learning along the way.
And we're quite ambitious about that. We're talking 100 lifeboats now in the next while.
Mm-hmm. And we think it's possible. So I think that, you know, the reason why we're excited about this model is we think that good enough for now, safe enough to try, creates a low barrier of entry. It makes it easier for people to join in because the risks are reduced. We also reduce or eliminate the analysis paralysis of what are we going to do? What could we possibly do? How could we do anything that's big enough? Instead, we turn that on its head. What can we do right now? And we'll figure out the other stuff later. It makes it easier for us to have rich collaboration, in part because we're focusing on practical projects, and nothing facilitates collaboration faster than actually working on something on the ground together. And it also gives us the opportunity to practice our communication skills and our listening and understanding skills, because a lot of those abstract concepts are getting turned into practical action. And probably most importantly from April and my perspective is we are maximizing our learning potential, and that maximizes our adaptability. So even if we're thrown a curveball, even if something happens that we didn't see coming, we can figure out how quickly we can mobilize the resources that we do have available and figure out something that at least is good enough to try. So those are our ideas. And now we'd like to turn it over and see, well, does that make sense? Do you have any questions for clarification? And is there anything in this that you find promising, anything appealing, or any concerns, anything that's missing? So at this point, I'm going to stop the slide share and just open it up to questions or comments.
I'm going to have to leave in about 10 minutes. So if you don't mind, this is terrific. I really find this very helpful, the way you have done all this work and produced something that is graspable, seems doable. I'm still uncertain about it'll be interesting to go into the Bowker Creek crew after this and see where, if I do find an entry point somewhere in the conversation with them. I did mention it to the fellow who's the head of Parks and Recreation, and he actually was receptive. And I gave him your name, but I think maybe I'll remind him of that again, because I think it would be very interesting if someone at that level in the district was interested, because he's also the fellow who's driving the Cool Kit project, which is the one that's organizing the neighborhood and already mobilized, I guess, about 50 people who live around the area. So there's a potential there. Anyway, because I have to go, I just want to say thank you very much. The only thing that I would suggest in the beginning is I would really like to know who these good people are a little better, but I understand that there is limited time for that level of relationality. But just before I go, could you give me a sense of what the follow through or follow up is for this?
Mhm. Well, and I will say we are also applying the model as we are building the model. So we're trying what we can try, and we're seeing where there's uptake. Ultimately, what I would like, we're on the same page on this, is people who would identify as, we come up with different names because it's a lifeboat. I don't know if you remember the Love Boat and Julie, the cruise director. And I have this image of a bunch of Julie, the cruise directors, sort of the local neighborhood coordinator or point person. And ultimately, I would like to have a mentoring and coaching relationship with those people. We have some ideas for how, actually drawing on a model that Allison is familiar with, where we have basically support circle for, say 10 to 15 local coordinators with a facilitator, where they come together periodically, say every 2 weeks or so. And it becomes an opportunity where they can share, here's what we're working on, here's some of the challenges that we're experiencing. And then as a group, they can sort of brainstorm what some of the approaches could be. And then in addition, April and I would provide our organizing experience, where anybody could basically book time with us and say, here's what we're trying to do. With Bunker Creek, we had this meeting. I thought this or this might be a possibility. What do you think? How could we move forward with that? To provide that kind of level, a little bit of overhead support structure to the local organizers. And in addition, we also have a webinar for each of the different steps that goes more into, if you're ready to invite your friends, here are some things to include in the invitation, or think about in the invitation. Here's a way of setting up that circle conversation and some of the fundamentals of hosting a circle. A separate webinar that would go into the detailed nitty-gritty for each of the 5 steps. Anything that I'm forgetting, April?
No, you've been describing the deeper dives in terms of process. It might also be useful to sign up for a navigating via attentions session to see how that works. It's kind of a magic thing. And, again, we are available as coaches for whatever. But the most important part, I think, that we want to express is to host your own circle if you can. You already have an intact circle of relationships that probably are willing to put up with some time to be with you around this topic. And so hosting that would I think pay off in all kinds of ways. You also might want to join in what we're calling lifeboat circles. So we ourselves, with random strangers and sometimes not so random folks that we know and invite, are doing the circle conversations so that we can hear how people would think a lifeboat, what it should include, how it is that people can come together around that. So we're continuing, even though we've already kind of used up our friends, I think, for a circle, we're continuing to cast out the invitation around the world. Actually, we're doing some international work with this. And we will keep out of that doing the debriefs and the understanding of the trends and issues and themes that come out of that, and then reapply that to this work as well. Kind of keeps things fresh, and you can learn new stuff easily that way.
I just wanted to slide in an apology to Carly. I didn't see your comment because my screen was full. So I'm sorry that I didn't notice that. And I don't know what to do about it anyhow, because I did have it full screen on my computer. Anyhow, just wanted to put that in. And Pamela?
Yeah, just before I go, Ben, since you're a member of Earth Regenerators, I understand that you probably have a full and rich life outside of the web, but I'm wondering if you would consider presenting something about this in the project incubator.
Oh, totally. It's
would be-
on, yeah, it's on my radar. I was in a week-long training last week that, and then we were getting ready for this. So it's on my radar. It just hasn't made it to the top of the to-do list yet. But I even have the spreadsheet still up for the incubator times.
If you don't mind, I'll just put Earth Regenerators in the chat, and if anyone wants to, just look up that community. It's a very good place to go to get clarity about collapse and all that good stuff, and really to connect with people and bring the spirit into things and have fun. Thanks so much, you guys. Nice to meet everybody.
Yep,
Nice
and we'll
to
keep
meet
in
you.
touch. We'll
Yes,
definitely
please,
keep in
yeah.
touch.
Thank you.
I just want to offer to Carly, would it be useful to have the slide package if you didn't see the full screen? Would that be helpful?
No, that's okay. I could kind of adjust it on my screen, but
Good.
I don't know. Was it only me that it was like in the middle of the screen and it was small? The rest of you had, no, you did have it. Yeah. I think it might be just what you select when you're sharing your screen on Zoom, like which window you select, but that's fine.
Yeah, I am open to coaching on that. I have a real hard time with there's that aspect of, and especially when I'm hosting, I don't see what it looks like to other people. So yeah, any tips and tricks in that direction, I'm very welcome. Any other questions, comments, suggestions?
Can I ask a couple questions? Like these may be no-brainer things that I should know the answer to, but in the spirit of experimentation, I won't pass that judgment. So the focus of this is people coming together to identify actions through conversation and relationship building, to identify practical actions out of concern for global warming.
Mm-hmm. Or
Okay.
and or societal collapse. Challenge. That's one of the reasons we like Lifeboat in general.
Okay.
Is whatever the turbulence is you think we're preparing for, we can be agnostic. Whatever your concerns are, we can bring that into the Lifeboat.
Okay. And yeah, so I guess, you know, I have this tendency to connect a whole bunch of things in my mind, and before you know it, it's something so big that it can feel more like having a very large rock rather than a lifeboat. So that's just one question. So it can be kind of any focus in that realm. And then I assume you're not talking necessarily about geographic networks. So it could be the condo that I live in. Or it could be the street I live on, or it could be people in my network that I know care about something like some aspect of global warming, or without having to have agreement ahead of time about which actions or which things we're most concerned about.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's the spirit, is that each local lifeboat is going to find its own scope and focus, and that you are starting. I have a bias towards place-based, and I can't remember who was saying like walking distance. It might have been Pamela.
Yeah.
For me, I'm lucky. I live on an island, so it naturally defines my community. But I think it really. We are open to that. This could be a network that is not even geographically centered. It's possible. And that's, I think the brilliance of it is it's whatever your lifeboat needs to be. It's really just it's creating a container in which whoever comes together can shape what they need it to be. Again, I would have a bias towards place-based, like within where you can physically see each other, you can connect with each other if you need to in case of emergencies, again, I'm on an island, so our big thing is if the ferries don't run, what do we do?
Right.
And that adds a really natural frame to how we talk about things. But yeah, it's whatever your network needs it to be.
Thanks.
The other thing I think when I think about this, I think even if there wasn't societal collapse kind of hovering in the background and other existential threats, even as a society that's coming out of a plague or learning to deal with some level of plague for the next however long, these are healthy behaviors. Any of this stuff will help build social fabric, and it's been frayed.
Mhm.
And I see in working with organizations and communities, wherever I work with them, there's a level of anxiety, there's a level of reinsurance needed that didn't exist before. And there is trauma that has come because of 2.5 years of the way that we've been living. And so doing any of these steps really in the name of simply knitting our society together differently
Mhm.
is helpful. And that's why I started out doing this work. Then I got scared about droughts and things like that, which I'm living in now on the Sunshine Coast. But certainly it is a healthy way to work.
Yeah, and I would add also, if we want to talk seriously about reconciliation or decolonization and how we rebuild our relationships to each other, my take on it too is I've become almost rabidly anti-ideological and anti-conceptual. And I think a lot of the problems that we are experiencing right now is that we have lost our direct connection, both interpersonally and to the material reality of our lives. So not just the fact that we're coming through this pandemic, but also that we're coming through a pandemic on the heels of generations of attacks on community. You know, that's been a prime tool of colonization and capitalism, has been to undermine our ability to take care of ourselves and each other. And we need to heal that. So yeah, whether or not we were facing existential crises, it's still, I think, a valuable thing for us to be doing.
Yeah, agree.
A number of things. I really love the model. I like structure like that. It makes me happy. It reminds me of when I left the Lower Mainland because it didn't feel a safe place to be at a point earlier in my life. And I moved to Fino and worked with environmental activists there to create something. We didn't know when it would happen, but we wanted to be ready. And I worked for a couple of years and helped to build something that became what happened in 1993. And this reminds me of that, the community that we built, a lot of the connections, working with what we had available. And so that's lovely. Thank you. I really, it's wonderful. What I've found since then is I'm a single, low-income person by myself, and survival has put me in a city where I'm really not connected to much of anything. And yes, this is the direction in which I want to move, is to reconnect. Not sure I'm in the place to be a hub yet, or but certainly this is hopeful and empowering, and it's, I think, what we all need very much. So I really thank you for the work that you've done and the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I feel moved to say I don't want to take credit for a lot of what we're doing. I think we're largely repackaging things that other people have known and developed, and really just we are trying to put it in a nice, simple, non-threatening package. And it's really the wisdom of, lots and lots of other people. And also that I think there is something around mutual aid and creating part of our material reality is figuring out how do we have equitable relationships and access to resources in a world that is not equal economically, not just economically, but so like some of those, I think those are real serious questions that we need to ask in terms of like, what does mutual support look like, mutual aid? And, you know, if for example, you were going to take on more of a role of creating those invitations, how do you also make sure that your time is accounted for? And that your needs are accounted for. You're bringing a gift to the table. I'm very committed to moving towards the gift economy or a circular economy, whatever we want. It's something we have to invent again. But how do we have conversations about what is fair and equitable in terms of access to resources and effort put forward? And how do we make sure that it's possible for you to do what you feel called to do, and it doesn't become a hardship, it doesn't become a burden? I don't know how we do that exactly, but I think it's part of the conversation. Any other thoughts or questions? Well, we are
You didn't tell
right
us how to make friends. How do you make friends to start?
at...
I mean, I joke, but I also don't joke.
Well, you know, I think that it's kind of the social asset thing. We often don't have a good sense of the resources that are already in our life. Sometimes we don't recognize the value, the relationships that we have and the friendships that we have. I know for you, Carly, personally, you have lots of friends right here. You made serious friends.
There.
I know, but you could if you wanted to.
No, there's
we
just so
keep
much
saying,
work.
come on.
There's just so much work to be done in Vancouver.
I know, but
so many things to do.
all I'm saying is that I know from personal experience that you can make friends pretty easily because I've seen you make them pretty quickly. So, but I think part of it is, this is probably an inappropriate story, but I had a long-term relationship that ended without my consent. And I remember, and it was like it was my partner and my friend. And when I got dumped, I was like, oh, I've got nothing, you know, and here I am, I'm so isolated. And people came out of the woodwork to support me. And in part, I think it was because I was letting myself be supported, where, you know, instead of maintaining my, you know, my status or whatever, my self-identity. And I think that that's also one of the opportunities in reaching out around the lifeboat is, I will say, in the circles that we have done, I have been amazed and impressed at how quick and how deep strangers who have never met each other get in one of these circles. If you create the opportunities, people show up. So I think, you know, there's still healing to be done in terms of, you know, how we think of relationships and how we think of ourselves in relationship with people. But we're hardwired for that. You know, like it's actually in our genetic programming. So we just have to kind of rediscover some old skills.
If you get more Vancouver-based people in these things, connect us to each other.
I do, and we have heard, I mean, it's urban. One of the conversations that we've had and will continue to have is, how does this work in a rural area versus a suburban area versus a small town versus an urban area? And those are going to look different. But they also have strengths, you know, like the challenge of being in a city in terms of it is harder to make connections. It also, there's a lot more resources available once you make those connections. So, you know, it's everything's an opportunity and a risk at the same time, right? So, and I think also that's also where the social support comes in terms of, as each of us are starting to do that work of reaching out, how do we come together and share notes? What's working, what's not? You know, even if we can't connect you with people in Vancouver, if we can connect you with people in other urban areas, where actually that just reminds me, one of the circles we did, somebody was in Atlanta and was saying, there's nobody here who can, I know nobody here cares about the environment. I'm the only one. And there were some people who actually knew of organizations in Atlanta, groups that were working, and they said, oh, here, contact this person.
Wow.
So even in that circle, people were creating some opportunities that the other person didn't know existed. Well, I want to thank everybody for showing up today and giving us some airtime. I really appreciate it. Like I said, we are still kind of working things out as we're going. So we will follow up. Sometimes the follow-up isn't as timely as you might expect, but we definitely will be following up. We're doing another one of these webinars next week, and we'll probably follow up as a batch to everybody after that. And if you haven't experienced one of the circles, we also are hosting another circle conversation next Tuesday, actually Tuesday at 4. So this same time, but next week, and that would be online and just be an opportunity to experience what it's like to have that more extended conversation. So with that, I think I will, it's a good time to do a closing and a wrap up. I want to check with April to make sure there's nothing else that you want to add.
Nope.
All right.
Well,
And
the paying it forward piece.
right. Part of working into the gift economy is that we are also offering this as a pay it forward. So we are putting everything out that we have for anybody who needs it. But if it is something that you find of value and you want it to be available for people after you, we have a fundraiser page that eventually we'll send a link to it. And if you are in a position where you feel like you can make a contribution, that would be great. Or pass along the information to your friends if they might be able to make a contribution. But that's also part of this. Is not a funded project. This is self-funded, but we're doing it willingly and gratefully because we want our own lifeboats. We want the fleet around us. So we are doing this out of our own self-interest.
We're also willing to accept baked goods. That's part of paying it forward as well. So keep in touch if you're a baking person.
Yeah. Baked goods.
Sure you don't want us to send water?
April, probably
Please.
you can send water to April. Yeah, we're good on water here.
Thank you for your thoughtfulness.
If I could send you water, I would.
Awesome. Well, thank you all, and we'll keep in touch and keep the faith.
Thank you.